it would be actually inadequate and impossible and really irresponsible for me to relay even an overview, I think, of what Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz's many contributions have been in the little time that I have up here. And I suspect that many of you already know a lot about her efforts for crafting a better, more just, more humane world, and her precise attention to those peoples and issues least attended to by our society, and to social justice. I'm here tonight because of those reasons, and I'm here because she's been especially active and influential in relation to Indigenous peoples. I also know that I have been personally living in or within the sort of substantial wake of her for some time, although I only really became aware of this maybe 5 years ago in a conscious way. Although I've actually trailed behind her in weird ways, in one way or another at several institutions, actually, San Francisco State, Mills College, UCLA, CSU East Bay. I don't know, I'm following you around, I think. I've only met her, even though I was following her in these ways, trailing, I only met her once in person when she delivered the 2010 keynote address marking the 20th anniversary of ethnic studies at UC San Diego, which was my alma mater. I sadly actually missed much of her speech that day, but she later very generously met with me after and then emailed me to supply the text that she had delivered that day, which I am actually ashamed to say that I had never read until this week. One of those things, right? More important than my rather pitiful misdeeds is the symbol, I thought, of the generosity that she displayed that day by offering me her words and her thoughts. She provided a most valuable gift, the knowledge and wisdom of an elder, which reflects the offerings that I think she continues to supply to us all through her writings, her activism, her tenacity. And so I trust that tonight you will be much better receivers of her gifts than I was 5 years ago when I did not read her text. What has been most impressive and invaluable for me as a young Native person and young scholar is her insistence not just on speaking into the world that which is too often left unsaid or sometimes purposely silenced, but also her insistence on truly complicating the very foundations of her scholarly field, of my field. She draws, I think, needed thoughtfulness to the tensions within ethnic studies and the broader social and legal articulations of multiculturalism, both of which are, I think, too often depend on assumptions of settler colonialism, which means they depend on the ongoing and long-standing dispossession of Native peoples and the continual denial of full sovereignty, just by the fact of failing to honestly discuss the land upon which we all stand on right now. Thus, rights and culture and inclusion are simply not enough. So one of the things that Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz does so well, and I assume you'll very undoubtedly soon hear, is remind us that the histories of indigenous genocide and dispossession are the very roots, the core genealogy, the essential blueprint, and thus the DNA of both our nation and of the global American empire that now stands. So, I bid you listen well. Thank you for listening to me. That is all. And now I have the great pleasure to just ask that we extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz.
Can you hear me? Good. I have a very soft voice, so if I stray from the microphone, tell me to get closer. Well, I understand sports coming from Oklahoma, so I really appreciate it that you didn't go to the basketball game that came here. Instead of condemning those, I understand that, you made a sacrifice, I think. So it's wonderful to be here. And I too want to pay tribute to the Kalapuya nation whose unceded lands we are on. Well, this is really a great honor to be invited to present the 32nd annual Ava, Helen, and Linus Pauly Memorial Lecture for World Peace. It is important that this OSU lectureship honors Linus Pauling, an OSU graduate and two-time Nobel laureate, and his wife, Ava Helen Pauling, a devoted peace activist that I always heard about but never got to meet her in person. To me, she was almost as famous as Linus Pauling because of her activities in the Bay Area. And I want to thank the sponsor, the College of Liberal Arts of OSU, as well as all those involved in organizing the event. We are, I don't have to tell you, living in a dark moment in the history of humanity and of the earth itself, still under the threat of nuclear catastrophe, with added rapid warming of our planet due to human production. Never has the call for peace been more critical than now. And as Martin Luther King said in 1967, the United States is the main purveyor of violence in the world today. He said that in 1967 during the Vietnam War, but it's true today as well, unfortunately. Despite the efforts of many, including myself, we have to do more. And the United States of America is the prime motor of violence, war, and pollution. So the fate of humanity depends upon what we who live here think and act upon. To fulfill that responsibility, and I think it's the only thing that will save us both morally, ethically, and physically, we must come to terms with the past of the United States. I am a historian, but I don't think it's just because I'm a historian that I think the past is important. I think the past is important because we still live in that past. It's still with us. It's not, as William Faulkner says, it's not even past. So this evening I will address the future of the United States by addressing its history. So I call this, for those of you who've read the book, some of it will ring familiar, as the last chapter, the conclusion of the book, I titled The Future of the United States. And I'm not a soothsayer. I cannot tell you what the future is, but I can tell you what it will be if we don't stop it, I think. And I am sure you can imagine that as well. But I think there are some things fundamental things we have to address to be able to have the consciousness necessary for changing the world and for a peaceful and just world. The Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird has written that the continued colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands provides the United States the economic and material resources needed to cast its imperialist gaze globally is a fact that is simultaneously obvious within and yet continually obscured by what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect multicultural, multiracial democracy. The status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt that construction. Well, the conventional narrative of U.S. history routinely segregates the Indian Wars, so-called, as a subspecialization within the dubious category of, quote, the West. But the architecture of U.S. world dominance was designed and tested by the period of continental U.S. militarism, 1780 to 1890, the unending, unrelenting, constant wars against the native peoples of what is now the United States. The opening of the 21st century saw a new, even more brazen form of U.S. militarism and imperialism explode on the world, followed by 2 military invasions and hundreds of small wars employing U.S. special forces around the globe, re-establishing a template based on the Indian Wars. One highly regarded military analyst, if you will have seen this guy on Fox News or elsewhere as a right-wing spokesman, it may be disturbing that I use him as a source, but he's actually a military historian and knows the facts and actually admits the truth. He just thinks it's a good thing. So he makes a connection between the Indian Wars and what he considers the country's bright imperialist past and future. This is Robert D. Kaplan. In his 2005 book, Imperial Grunts, presented several case studies that he considered highly successful operations in Yemen, Colombia, Mongolia, and the Philippines, in addition to what he calls ongoing complex projects in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. While U.S. citizens and many of their elected representatives called for ending U.S. military interventions they knew about, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Kaplan hailed protracted counterinsurgencies in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Pacific. He presented a guide for the U.S. controlling those areas of the world based on its having achieved continental dominance in North America by means of counterinsurgency and employing total and unlimited war against the native peoples. Kaplan is a meticulous researcher. He's an influential writer. He was born in 1952 in New York City. He wrote for major newspapers and magazines before serving as chief geopolitical strategist for the private security think tank Stratford in Austin. Among other prestigious posts, he's been senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Defense Policy Board, a federal advisory committee to the U.S. Department of Defense. In 2011, Foreign Policy magazine named Kaplan as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. Author of numerous best-selling books, including Balkan Ghosts and Surrender or Survive, that's a good one too. Kaplan became one of the principal intellectual boosters for U.S. power through tried and true first way of war of the United States. This is the way of war dating to the British colonial period that military historian John Grenier describes as a combination of, quote, unlimited war and irregular war, a military tradition that has accepted, legitimized, and encouraged attacks upon and destruction of non-combatants, villages, and agricultural resources in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of conquest. Kaplan sums up his thesis in the prologue to Imperial Grunts, which he subtitles Indian Country. I take it all of you know that Indian Country is a technical term in military, U.S. military annals, and is used constantly in the military and often in news programs, especially during the first Gulf War, as Indian Country. Enemy territory is still, the code word is Indian Country, and it's shortened quite often to Indian Country. And in country, you hear that term, people think that's not, they don't know that's the same thing. It's a shortened term for enemy territory. So Kaplan writes, by the turn of the 21st century, the United States military had already appropriated the entire earth and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops at a moment's notice. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands, similar to the way that the Indian country of the American West had been divided in the mid-19th century by the U.S. Army. According to the soldiers and Marines I'm quoting him, I met on the ground in far-flung corners of the earth, the comparison with the 19th century was apt. Welcome to Indian country was the refrain I heard from troops from Colombia to the Philippines, including Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terrorism was really about taming the frontier, unquote. Kaplan goes on to ridicule elites of New York and Washington who debate imperialism in grand historical terms, calling it the Roman Empire and that this is a terrible thing, the United States is not an empire. Well, individuals from all the armed services interpret policy according to the particular circumstances they face and are indifferent to or unaware of the fact that they are a part of an imperialist project. To them, and for many U.S. Americans, United States military power is the heart of their patriotism, and the military is revered as no other governmental institution is. Pointing to the intentionality of U.S. colonialism in North America, Kaplan challenges the concept of manifest destiny, arguing that it was, quote, not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in the western part of the continent. Rather, he argues, it was the work of, quote, small groups of frontiersmen separated from each other by great distances. Here Kaplan refers to what Grenier calls rangers, self-organized settlers who destroyed indigenous towns and fields and food supplies, murdering the inhabitants. Kaplan equates these settler vigilantes to the modern special forces. He acknowledges that the regular army, also in the West, in the Indian Wars, provided lethal backup for settler counterinsurgency, especially in slaughtering the buffalo, the food supply of the Plains people, as well as making continuous raids on settlements to kill or confine the families of indigenous resistance fighters. Kaplan summarizes the genealogy of U.S. materialism today. He writes, whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished, for many commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians, unquote. The legacy of the Indian Wars is palpable in the numerous military bases spread around across the South, the Middle West, and particularly the Great Plains. I'm still quoting Kaplan. That vast desert and steppe comprising the Army's historical heartland, punctuated by such storied outposts as Fort Hays, Kearney, Leavenworth, Riley, and Sill. Leavenworth, where the Oregon and Santa Fe trails separated, was now the home of the Army's Command and General Staff College. Riley, Fort Riley, the base of George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, now that of the 1st Infantry Division. And Sill, where Geronimo lived out the last years of his life, the headquarters of U.S. artillery. While microscopic in size, it was the fast and irregular military actions against the Indians, memorialized in bronze and oil by Remington, that shaped the nature of American nationalism, unquote. Although Kaplan relies principally on the post-Civil War source of U.S. counterinsurgency. It actually dates, and the West dates, from the original 13 colonies, even before U.S. independence. Kaplan acknowledges this in a footnote in which he reports what he learned at the Airborne Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Quote, "It is a small but interesting fact that members of the 101st Airborne Division, in preparation for their parachute drop, shave themselves in Mohawk style and apply war paint on their faces. This takes us back to the pre-independence colonial wars, and then through U.S. independence and the myth popularized in The Last of the Mohegans. Except for that instance, Kaplan seems unaware of the deeper historical roots of the continuing U.S. military's fetish for Indian warfare." So I agree with everything he says, but he doesn't, in describing what the military is today and where it come from, but it goes back much further than that. It's like a 300-year history, which I write about in the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Well, here's an example. On March 19, 2003, near the Iraqi desert in Kuwait, Associated Press reporter Ellen Meyer illustrated the symbolic power of Indian wars as a source of U.S. military memory and practice. Once again, we find troops retracing historical bloody footprints back to the 19th century Seminole Wars in this case. Meyer wrote, "Tank crews from the Alpha Company, 4th Battalion, 64th Armored Division perform what they call a Seminole war dance before convoying to a position near the Iraq border on Wednesday, March 19, 2003. Captain Philip Wolford's men leaped into the air and waved empty rifles in an impromptu war dance. With thousands of M1A1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, and trucks, the mechanized infantry unit known as the Iron Fist would be the only U.S. armored division in the fight and would likely meet any Iraqi defenses head-on." And Wolford, the commander, says, "We will be entering Iraq as an army of liberation, not domination." After a brief prayer, Wolford leaped into an impromptu desert war dance. Camouflaged soldiers joined him, jumping up and down in the sand, chanting and brandishing their rifles. So the Seminole war dance is serious business. The 3 declared wars against the Seminole Nation in Florida, which almost no one as ever knows studying U.S. history, and the Florida Everglades spanned as the longest war in U.S. history, 42 years, with some breaks in between. They call them 3 wars, from 1816 to 1858. This is the span of Andrew Jackson's career. First as a Tennessee militia man without any permission from the federal government, leading militias from Tennessee into Georgia to crush the Creek Muskogee farmers there. They were very intensive farmers living in villages long before the Europeans came. Then, for that deed, rather than being called upon to get some permission to do something like that, because in the Constitution it says only the federal government can deal with foreign nations and Indian tribes, they gave him a generalship in the Army for it. And then he invaded the Everglades, fought the war there. Then for that, he became the most popular president in U.S. history for 2 terms. So I have a whole chapter on Jackson. So, the Seminole Wars remain deeply embedded in U.S. military tradition and practice. So many congressional medals of honor, so many battle stories that, they tell, the oral history that they tell in the military, particularly the permanent military culture, which is often passed father to son and unfortunately these days to daughter. Well, in early 2011, the ghost of the Seminole Wars came back. A Yemeni citizen, Ali Hamza Abalul, was serving a life sentence at Guantanamo as an enemy combatant, so-called, a military tribunal having convicted him of crimes associated with his service to al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden's media secretary. In arguing on appeal that Balul's conviction be upheld, a Pentagon lawyer, Navy Captain Edward S. White, relied on a precedent from an 1818 tribunal. In his 37-page military commission's brief, Captain White wrote, quote, "Not only was the Seminole belligerency unlawful, but much like modern al-Qaeda, the very way in which the Seminoles waged war against U.S. targets itself violate the customs and usages of war." So the Center for Constitutional Rights, which had brought the appeal representing Abalul, objected to this passage in the government's brief, saying the court should reject the government's notable reliance on the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, a genocide that led to the Trail of Tears. The government's characterization of Native American resistance to the United States as much like modern-day al-Qaeda is not only factually wrong, but overtly racist, and cannot present any legitimate legal basis to uphold Mr. Balul's conviction. In response, the Pentagon's General Counsel issued a letter stating that the U.S. government stood by its precedent. So that's standing law. But the Seminole Wars are not the only precedent embedded in the U.S. military. Afghans resisting U.S. forces and others who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time were taken into custody, and most of them were sent to a hastily constructed prison facility on the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on land the United States appropriated with a supposedly 99-year lease in 1898 in their war against Cuba, supposedly against the Spanish in Cuba. Rather than bestowing the status of prisoner of war on the detainees, which would have given them certain rights under the Geneva Conventions, they were designated as unlawful combatants, a status thought to have been previously unknown in the annals of European warfare. As such, the detainees were subjected to torture by U.S. interrogators and shamelessly monitored by civilian psychologists and medical personnel. Much of the rhetoric following the declaration of the War on Terror after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, references U.S. militaristic memory of the wars against Native nations. In response to questions and condemnations from around the globe, a University of California international law professor, John C. Yu, on leave to serve as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, penned in March 2003 what became the infamous torture memo. Despite strong objections to the unlawful combatant moniker, not much was made at the time of one of the precedents used to defend the designation unlawful combatant. A U.S. Supreme Court's 1873 opinion in Modoc Indian prisoners. So this is being a Supreme Court decision that has stood and obviously still stands, and therefore is a part of the Constitution. This is the situation that was brought to that Supreme Court case. In 1872, the Modoc leader, Kent Posh, also known as Captain Jack, led some 150 of his people to return to their country in Northern California after the U.S. Army had rounded them up and forced them to share a reservation in Oregon. 53 insurgent fighters from the group were surrounded by U.S. troops and Oregon militia and forced to take refuge in the barren and rugged lava beds around Mount Lassen, a dormant volcano, a part of their ancestral homeland that they knew every inch of. More than 1,000 troops commanded by General Edward R.S. Canby, a former Civil War general, attempted to capture the resistors, but had no success as the Modocs engaged in effective guerrilla warfare. Before the Civil War, General Canby had built his military career fighting in the Second Seminole War and later in the invasion of Mexico in 1846. Posted to Utah on the eve of the Civil War, he had led attacks against the Navajos and then began his Civil War service in New Mexico. Therefore, Canby was a seasoned Indian killer. In negotiations between the general and Kent Posh, the Modoc leader, Kent Posh killed the general and the other commissioners when they announced that they would allow no resolution other than Modoc total surrender in response. So the Army command dispatched another Civil War general with more than 1,000 soldiers as reinforcements. And in April 1873, these troops attacked the Modoc stronghold, this time forcing the Modoc resistors to flee and most of them being captured. Mind you, these were 53 people fighting thousands of U.S. soldiers. After 4 months of fighting that cost the United States almost $500,000, which is equal to $10 million now, and the lives of more than 400 of its soldiers and a general, the nationwide backlash against the Modocs was vengeful. Kent Posh and several other captured Modocs were designated prisoners of war, imprisoned. They should have been designated prisoners of war, and were not because of the Supreme Court decision, but they were imprisoned and tried and hanged at Alcatraz. And the Modoc families were scattered and incarcerated on reservations as far away as Oklahoma. Kent Posh's corpse was embalmed and exhibited at circuses around the country. So drawing on a legal analogy between the Modoc prisoners who sued for prisoner of war status and went to the Supreme Court, and the Guantanamo detainees, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Yu employed the legal category of homo sacer. In Roman law, a person banned from society, excluded from its legal protections, but still subject to the sovereign's power. Anyone may kill a homo sacer without it being considered murder. To buttress his claim that the detainees could be denied prisoner of war status, Yu quoted from the 1873 Modoc Indian prisoner's opinion, which read, "All the laws and customs of civilized warfare may not be applicable to an armed conflict with the Indian tribes upon our western frontier, but the circumstances attending the assassination of Canby, the Army General, and Thomas, the U.S. Peace Commissioner, are such as to make their murder as much a violation of the laws of the savage as of civilized warfare, and the Indians concerned in it fully understood the baseness and treachery of their act." So in a war, it's illegal to kill a U.S. general. It's one-sided. So thereby, anyone could be defined as an Indian, could thus be killed legally, and they could also be held criminally responsible for engaging any U.S. soldier. So what we really have there in Iraq and Afghanistan are Indian wars. They made it so in law. Indigenous peoples in the rest of the world are treated as were Native Americans, as impediments to U.S. military requirements. The Chagos archipelago comprises more than 60 small coral islands isolated in the Indian Ocean, halfway between Africa and Indonesia, 1,000 miles south of the nearest continent, India. Between 1968 and 1973, the United States and Britain, the latter having been the colonial administrator, forcibly removed the indigenous inhabitants of the islands. Most of the 2,000 deported Chagosians ended up more than 1,000 miles away in Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they were thrown into lives of poverty and forgotten. The purpose of this expulsion was to create a major U.S. military base on one of the Chagosian islands, Diego Garcia. As if being rounded up and removed from their homelands in the name of global security were not cruel enough, the Chagosians, before being deported, had to watch as U.S. troops herded their pet dogs into sealed sheds where they were gassed and burned. As David Vine, whose book I highly recommend, writes in his chronicle of this tragedy, quote, "The base on Diego Garcia has become one of the most secretive and powerful U.S. military facilities in the world, helping to launch the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq twice, threatening Iran, China, Russia, and nations from southern Africa and to Southeast Asia, host to a secret CIA detention center for high-profile terrorist suspects, and home to thousands of U.S. military personnel and billions of dollars in deadly weaponry." The U.S. military established a pattern during and after the Vietnam War of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from sites deemed strategic for the placement of military bases. The peoples of the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific and Puerto Rico's Vieques Island are perhaps the best known examples, but there were also the Inugud of Thule, Greenland, and the thousands of Okinawans, Chamorros of Guam, and indigenous peoples of Micronesia. During the harsh deportation of the Micronesians in the 1970s, the press took some notice and expressed some concern about these people just being dragged and, forcibly removed. In response to one reporter's question, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said of the Micronesians, "There are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn?" So this is a statement of permissive genocide. By the beginning of the 21st century, the United States operated more than 900 military bases around the world. That's not counting the ones in North America and Canada, the United States, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the trusteeships of the United States in the Pacific. There are 287 in Germany, 130 in Japan, 106 in South Korea, 89 in Italy, 57 in the British Isles, 21 in Portugal, and 19 in Turkey. The number also comprised additional bases or installations located in Aruba, Australia, Djibouti, Egypt, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, Crete, Sicily, Iceland, Romania, Bulgaria, Honduras, Colombia, and Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, among many other locations in some 150 countries, along with those recently added in Iraq and Afghanistan. In her book, The Militarization of Indian Country, Anishinaabe activist and writer Winona LaDuke analyzes continuing negative effects of the military on Native Americans in the United States, and of course, Native Hawaiians and Alaskans. She considers the consequences wrought on Native economies, lands, futures, and people's right to self-determination. Indigenous territories in New Mexico bristle with nuclear weapons storage and weapons labs. And Shoshone and Paiute territories in Nevada are scarred by decades of above-ground and underground nuclear weapons testing. The Navajo Nation and some New Mexico pueblos have experienced decades of uranium strip mining, the pollution of water, and subsequent deadly health effects. Political scientist Cynthia Enlow, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy and military, observes that U.S. culture has become even more, she wrote about this in the, in the 70s and 80s, so this new book, she says, is much more militarized since the attacks on World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Her analysis of this trend draws on a feminist perspective, which gives it a really a deeper perspective. So quoting Enlow, militarization is happening at the individual level. When a woman who has a son is persuaded that the best way she can be a good mother is to allow the military recruiter to recruit her son so her son will get off the couch. When she is persuaded to let him go, even if reluctantly, she is being militarized. She's not as militarized as somebody who is a special forces soldier, but she's being militarized all the same. Somebody who gets excited because a jet bomber flies over the football field to open the football season and is glad that he or she is in the situation to see it is being militarized. So militarization is not just about the question, do you think the military is the most important part of the state? Obviously, that's an important question. It's not just, do you think that the use of collective violence is the most effective way to solve social problems, which is also a part of militarization, but it's also the ordinary daily culture in the United States. We see it all around us and in the media. But as military historian John Grenier notes, the cultural aspects of militarization are not new. They have deep historical roots, reaching into the nation's Anglo-settler past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries. Grenier writes, quote, beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also found a use for the first way of war in the construction of an American identity, which he puts in quotes. The enduring appeal of the romanticized myth of the settlement, never calling it conquest, of the frontier, either by actual men, such as Robert Rogers or Daniel Boone, or fictitious ones like Nathaniel Bumppo of James Fenimore Cooper's creation. And this points to what D.H. Lawrence called the myth of the essential white American. He meant descendants of the old settlers, as hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. These are some of my relatives on my father's side. The astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians with the Second Amendment as a sacred mandate is also intricately related to militaristic culture that goes way back. The militias referred to in the Second Amendment are those civilians who were mobilized to attack Indian towns, burning their fields, to take their lands and their food supply. Everyday life and culture in general are damaged by ramped up militarization, and this includes academia, particularly the social sciences, with psychologists and anthropologists being recruited as advisors to the military. Anthropologist David H. Price, in his indispensable book, Weaponizing Anthropology, remarks that, quote, anthropology has always fed between the lines of war. Anthropology was born of European and U.S. colonial wars. Price, like Enlow, sees an accelerated pace of militarization in the early 21st century. Today's, and quoting David Price, today's weaponization of anthropology and other social sciences has been a long time coming. And post 9/11, America's climate of fear, coupled with reductions in traditional academic funding, provided the conditions of a sort of perfect storm for the militarization of the discipline and the academy as a whole. Well, quoting Jody Bird again in her wonderful book, Transit of Empire, the story of the New World is horror. The story of America, a crime. It is necessary to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain a historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what has happened to and with indigenous peoples and what still happens today. It's not just past colonialist actions and genocidal acts, but also, quoting Jody Bird, the continued colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands that allows the United States to cast its imperialist gaze globally. So she calls the United States a crime scene. When I read that, I thought, wouldn't that be a great art political project to put yellow tape around the whole borders of the United States? And we could teach a lot that way, you know. How many want to do that? Good. Somebody started. Another term that has been used mainly by Canadian Native people is a race to innocence. And this is what occurs when individuals assume that they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression. This concept captures the understandable assumption made by new immigrants, for instance, or children of recent immigrants in any country. They cannot be responsible, they assume, for what occurred in their adopted country. Neither are those actually who are already citizens guilty, or those descended from Andrew Jackson himself. Yet, in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land affects the assumptions and behavior of living generations at any given time, including immigrants and the children of recent immigrants. Another aspect of the demand for U.S. dominion is a ghoulish one that appears under the guise of science. Despite passage in 1990 of the Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act, some researchers under the cloak of science have fought tooth and nail not to release the remains and burial offerings of some 2 million indigenous people held in storage, much of it uncatalogued in the Smithsonian Institution and other museums, and by universities, state historical societies, National Park Service offices, warehouses, and curio shops. Until the 1990s, archaeologists and physical anthropologists claimed to need the remains, which they labeled resources or data, but rarely as human remains or body parts, for purported scientific experimentation, but most were randomly stored in boxes and never studied. In doing so, they also challenged the definition of Native American and the claimant's right to sovereignty. They even accused Native Americans of being anti-science for seeking to repatriate the remains of their ancestors. However, since anthropologist Franz Boas in 1911 discredited the theories of racial differences and certainly superiority and inferiority upon which such research was based, measuring the skull, little actual examination of the indigenous body parts has taken place. When Ishi, identified by Anglos in 1911 as the last of the Yahi people of Northern California, when he died in 1916, the UC Berkeley anthropologist who had studied him and his culture, Arthur Kroeber, insisted on an indigenous traditional burial and no autopsy, according to Ishi's wishes. When asked about the cause of science, Kroeber said, quote, "If there is any talk about the interests of science, say for me that science can go to hell. Besides, I cannot believe that any scientific value is materially involved. We have hundreds of Indian skeletons and nobody ever comes to study them." Despite Kroeber's stance, Ishi's brain was removed and preserved and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. As anthropologist Eric Davis observes, the bodies have never had scientific value. Rather, they have become a fetish, a marker of value, the power of which derives specifically from the obscuring of the referent to which it originally referred. Davis claims that Indian identity and its material form, the dead body, has functioned for a very long time and with increasing power as a fetish, as war trophies, marking the possession of land by those who have conquered it already. The Kennewick Man phenomena of the 19th, this is up in Washington State, you probably heard about Kennewick Man. It revealed much about the pathology Davis references. In 1996, a nearly complete skeleton and skull were found on a riverbank on traditional land of the Umatilla Nation near Kennewick, Washington. The county coroner determined that the bones were ancient, at least 9,000 years old, and therefore Native American. Under the Native American Graves and Protection and Reparation Act, which was in force at that time, they should have been handed over immediately to the Umatilla Nation authorities. But a local archaeologist, James C. Chatters, asked to examine the remains. Several weeks later, Chatters called a press conference at which he proclaimed that the remains were Caucasoid and with a story to tell. Up to that moment, little attention had been paid to the find, but with Chatters' claims, it became a public sensation fueled by headlines such as in Discover magazine, "Europeans Invade America 20,000 BC." In the New Yorker, the good old elegant New Yorker, "Was someone here before the Native Americans?" And in U.S. News and World Report, "America Before the Indians." And in National Geographic, "Hunt for the First Americans." The archaeologists had made a series of logical conclusions from a bogus premise. The remains were ancient, the skeleton and skull were said not to resemble those of living natives, they might be more akin to those of modern Europeans, therefore Europeans were the first Americans. The Archaeological Institute of America dismissed such claims, denouncing the already discredited pseudoscience of determining racial characteristic projected back in time. Yet the claims stuck in the public mind and media bias, and still do today. Clearly, the controversy was not about science, but rather about native claims to antiquity, sovereignty and rights, and settler resentment. Chatters made this clear when he was interviewed on the CBS program 60 Minutes, a real low point for 60 Minutes. I watched it. It was gushing, the interviewer gushing over these findings. So he said in that interview, "The tribe's fight against further testing of Kennewick Men is based largely on fear. Fear that if someone was here before they were, their status as sovereign nations and all that goes with it, treaty rights and lucrative casinos, could be at risk." So the white supremacist group, a Sutro Folk Assembly, agreed completely and made a similar assessment. Kennewick Man is our kin. Native American groups have strongly contested this idea, perceiving they have much to lose if their status as the first Americans is overturned. We will not let our heritage be hidden by those who seek to obscure it. Chatters claimed that Kennewick Man has so many stories to tell, quote, he said, when you work with these individuals, you develop an empathy. It's like you know another individual intimately. Eric Davis, who I quoted before, called this identification with the remains pathological ventriloquism. He hasn't been able to get this article published, by the way. It's an unpublished article. It's really good. He's a specialist on Cambodia and the deaths there, the genocide there, and his wife is Seminole Indian, so he just couldn't pass up making, comments outside his specialization. So this points out that even it was to the point that even the judge was convinced by Chatters in the dispute with the Umatilla Nation. Quoting the judge, "The remains are like a book that can be read, a history written in bone instead of on paper, just as the history of a region may be read by observing layers of rock or ice or the rings of a tree." Very poetic judge. Yeah. 45 years ago, archaeologist Robert Silverberg wrote about the appeal of lost tribes to Anglo-Americans. Quote, "The dream of a lost prehistoric race in the American heartland was profoundly satisfying, and if the vanished ones had been giants or white men or Israelites or Danes or great white Jewish Toltec Vikings, so much the better. Anything but Indians, for that would provide evidence reminding Anglo-settlers' descendants that the continent was stolen, genocide committed, and the land repopulated by settlers who seek authenticity but never find it because of the lie they live with, suspecting the truth and fearing it." So we must ask, how can U.S. society come to terms with this past and change the future, direction of the future? How can it acknowledge responsibility? The late Native historian Jack Forbes always stressed that while living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did, they are responsible for the society they live in, which is a product of the past. Assuming this responsibility could provide a means of survival and liberation for everyone. Everyone and everything in the world is affected, for the most part negatively, by U.S. dominance and intervention, often violently through direct military means or through proxies. It must be an urgent concern when we struggle for world peace to tell the truth about our history. Indigenous peoples offer possibilities for life after empire. Also, possibilities that neither erase the crimes of colonialism nor require the disappearance of the original peoples colonized under the guise of including them as individuals through assimilation. That process rightfully starts by honoring the treaties the United States made with indigenous nations, by restoring all sacred sites, starting immediately with the Black Hills of Sioux land, and including most federally held parks and land and all stolen sacred items and human remains, and by payment of sufficient reparations for the reconstruction and expansion of Native nations. In the process, the continent will be radically configured physically and geographically and psychologically. For the future to be realized, it will require extensive education programs and the full support and active participation of the descendants of the settlers, the descendants of enslaved Africans and colonized Mexicans, as well as immigrant populations and their descendants. In the words of Acoma Pueblo poet Simon Ortiz from his book Sand Creek, The future will not be mad with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution. Thank you.